I'm Chad Douglas. Thanks for joining us as our parent company Sinclair Broadcasting and KHQA continue to work for you, keeping you informed on complex political issues facing our nation. In our Connect to Congress initiative, we now have Illinois Representative Darin LaHood with us this morning. He joins us via satellite in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. Hello, Representative LaHood.
Hey, Chad, great to be with you and your viewers today.
Good for you. We're glad that you're back. First up today, President Obama just announced that Merrick Garland as his nominee to be the next Supreme Court Justice. What is your reaction to this announcement, and what can you tell us about Judge Garland?
Well, I would just what I've read about Judge Garland. He's been on the D.C. Court of Appeals, which obviously is the second highest court in the country. The president has said for a number of weeks he was going to put forth a nominee. He did today. And now it's up to the U.S. Senate to decide on whether they want to have a hearing on this. I think we have really two competing constitutional principles here. We have the principle of the president's ability to nominate, but also we have, I think, the equally important prerogative of the Senate, which is to advise and consent. What does advise and consent mean? And I think we're going to hear a lot about that. Clearly, we have a presidential election that's going to take place in about 7 months in November. And when I talk to people in my district, this is an important position, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice vacancy. And so there's a lot of people, particularly in my district, that want to have the two presidential candidates, which we'll know officially here in a couple months, have them put forth their ideas on who they want as a pick for the Supreme Court, and let the people decide. We live in a democracy. We're going to have an election in November. Let the people decide who they want as their next president, and that person can then pick the justice. There's some precedent for this in our previous selection of Supreme Court justices on this close to presidential elections. And so from my point of view, I think it's important that we let the people decide and let democracy take place here. And so advising consent in the Senate is going to be something we're going to hear a lot about, but clearly if the people want the election to decide it, I think that's something we have to strongly consider.
And speaking of election, yesterday was election March 15th was Super Tuesday 2.0, 3.0, depends on how you look at it. The last we spoke, Congressman, you were supporting Marco Rubio, who then suspended his campaign after losing his home state of Florida. So what are your thoughts on the election, and where do you stand now?
Well, first of all, I would say we got record turnout in Illinois yesterday. Throughout my district, numbers were way up on voting. Numbers were way up in all of Illinois, early voting and actual same-day voting. I think in two of my counties, they had to keep polls open. So I love the fact that people are engaged. People want to be a part of the process. And for Illinois voters to have a say in who the next president is, I think is great on both sides. Just looking at the election yesterday, I think that's great for democracy. And obviously Donald Trump did well in Illinois. Ted Cruz got second. It clearly looks like Donald Trump is the front runner and going to be our nominee. And what I've said all along is I'm going to support the nominee. I think as a Republican, our weakest candidate is better than the alternative, and so I'm going to work hard for the nominee. Obviously, there's still time left in the process, and we'll know officially here once we get to our convention who the nominee is going to be. But Donald Trump won my district, the 18th Congressional District, did very well in my district, and people, there's a feeling out there in a mood that people are upset with politics as usual. They want to change. They're not happy with things, and I think that was reflective in the overwhelming vote yesterday for Trump, and secondly for Cruz.
Now, you mentioned too that some of the problems that were in a couple of counties in your district, one of them being Adams, another one Sangamon, where they ran out of ballots, people waited in line, some people were told they couldn't vote. What advice do you have for voters in your district about the trust of the system in which we elect our leaders?
Well, I mean, we live in a democracy. We have to have the ability for our constituents and taxpayers and voters to be able to vote. And so as a policymaker, either at the state level or the federal level, we have to provide those resources and make sure that it's as easy as possible under the law for people to vote. And so, I've been a strong proponent of those policies in the past. I'll continue to do that. But whether that's keeping polls open later, whether that's making sure that we have the proper resources to do that, having a free and open, but also a very competent and transparent election process has to be there.
Let's move on to some international issues now. Vladimir Putin of Russia has announced that this week the Russian military forces will pull out of Syria. What is your assessment of Russia's involvement there? Is this a welcomed exit?
Well, obviously, I'm happy that the peace process is starting to take hold. It's in its infancy right now, but we've had a brutal civil war in Syria, and I think it's to everybody's benefit that we have a ceasefire, that the parties try to come together and see if we can have a resolution. And so I'm happy that the fighting has stopped, that Russia, it appears, is going to pull out. Now we have to sit down at the table with the current regime in Syria, with the Russians, with the United States. But we have to think about how are we going to fill this void in Syria? How are we going to bring in a coalition government or a government that can function? I think we need to have a moderate Arab government in Syria. We cannot let ISIS continue to do what they're doing. We can't let the Islamic radicals do what they've done in Syria. So these negotiations are going to be important, but we also have to remember that we have to have some buy-in from our Arab allies there, whether that's Saudi Arabia, whether that's Turkey, whether that's Qatar. Have them come in. We can't just do it alone with American military. We have to have buy-in from the rest of the world, in particular our partners in the Middle East. But I think the Russians pulling out is a positive thing. I think sitting down at the table and negotiating is what we need to focus on for right now.
All right, new technology pops up every day that terrorists are exploiting, from iPhones to video games to new messaging apps. What, if anything, do you think can be done to stay ahead of technology in the fight against terrorism?
Well, we learned with the terrorist attacks in Paris that they were using some encryption, they were using some video games, it appears, and so I think we have to be more vigilant at the national intelligence level. I know the FBI is going to put forth some proposals, and the intelligence services, on how we can do a better job. Again, protecting privacy rights, but also making sure that we have the tools and the ability to find out what terrorist groups and entities that want to hurt America are doing. Specifically when it comes to encryption, right now it is difficult for law enforcement to have the ability to do some wiretaps and other things to get this information. And so I think at the federal level we have to look at how do we put in place policies to give our law enforcement the tools they need to do this. And encryption is a big part of that, and working with our technology companies. Some of those negotiations are going on right now. They've involved some of the conversations with Apple, but from my perspective, there are entities that want to harm America and want to hurt America. We saw it in San Bernardino, we saw it in Paris. We have to be vigilant when it comes to fighting terrorism, and again, from a policy standpoint, putting in rules and laws in place so that we have the ability to find out what these terrorists are doing has to be first and foremost. Public safety, national security has to be first and foremost.
I know fighting terrorism is very important to you, so I want to ask you a couple questions about ISIS. Your office has told us that President Obama missed a congressionally mandated deadline of February 15th to provide a comprehensive strategy to defeat ISIS. Since then, there have been a couple of bombings overseas, not necessarily tied to ISIS, but what are your thoughts on fighting this particular terrorist organization?
Well, we passed a law at the end of 2016 that mandated that the president come up with a plan on how to fight ISIS. That plan would have been detailed in terms of, military involvement, in terms of drones, in terms of intelligence services. That has yet to be submitted to Congress. And I think it's a reflection of this administration has not put a focus on how you defeat ISIS. All of our military folks said you have to have a plan in place to defeat ISIS. We have not seen that yet. From my point of view, ISIS is an entity that wants to just destroy Western civilization. If you look at what they believe in, they don't want women to be educated, they don't want women to drive, they are against everything. If you're a Christian, you believe in Jesus Christ, you're going to be beheaded. And so we have to, in the Congress, hold the administration's feet to the fire on this. They have to submit a plan. I believe strongly in this. It's either they win or we win. There is no negotiating with ISIS or these terrorists. And I've continually called on this administration. Let's see your plan. Come up to Capitol Hill. Come to our committees. Lay out a plan on how we're going to defeat ISIS. I spent time as a chief terrorism prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I've seen firsthand the entities out there that want to harm America, the groups that are out there. This has to be a focus of this administration. Unfortunately, it's not a matter of if, it's when we have another terrorist attack, both in the Middle East and in the United States, and we have to be vigilant.
Let's talk a little bit about Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The president has said that he wants to close it. I know we talked, I think it was last month, on your thoughts about bringing those terrorists to the United States. Where do you stand? Where does Congress stand these days on that detention center in Cuba?
Well, I think we're at a standstill here. I believe strongly that Guantanamo Bay is one of the safest military complexes anywhere in the world. And, you know, if you think about it, after 9/11, we had almost 900 military combatants held at Guantanamo Bay. There was not one that ever escaped or caused any harm to U.S. citizens there. I believe it's the perfect facility. That's what our military folks believe. To think that we're going to take those military combatants, these are not your standard criminals in the United States. These are military combatants, people that were on the battlefield that want to harm America, people that were involved in the planning of 9/11, people that were involved in many other terrorist attacks. I do not want them in our federal prisons here in the United States, whether that's in Illinois, whether that's in Colorado, whether that's in Indiana. We should not have those here. We need to keep those prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and the Congress feels strongly about that. I feel strongly about that. Remember, when you're a military combatant under the law, you're not entitled to the same constitutional provisions that a criminal in the United States would be. These are folks that, again, are on the battlefield wanting to harm America, engaged in military activity to hurt America.
Final question for you, Congressman, then we got to let you go. What are your thoughts on the seemingly increased use of heroin that's happening back here in your home districts?
Yeah, well, it's very unfortunate. The epidemic of heroin has spread all over the United States, and particularly in my district. I wrote a letter 2 weeks ago to the National Center on Drug Policy and the Obama administration's Director of Drug Policy, asking that this be elevated in my district. We've asked for a hearing to be held in Central Illinois to address this. More people die now of drug overdoses than do in car accidents. And in my district alone, it's risen almost 20% in the last year. And this transcends all economic boundaries and rural and urban boundaries. And it's really based on two things. The potency of heroin has gotten so high, and the addictive nature of that, it is causing a lot of these deaths. The other part of it is the influx and the ability to get heroin is even I mean, there's so much more ability to get heroin now in Central Illinois because it's grown in Central and South America. And so you talk to folks in law enforcement, people in our medical community, our educators, and families that are affected by this. This is a growing problem. And so, again, as a former prosecutor, we need to focus on this. How do we get more resources into addiction? How do we get more resources to law enforcement to stop it coming in? How do we prosecute the dealers that are involved in this? So I'm going to continue to be very vocal on this. We're going to have a series of roundtable discussions throughout my district, whether that's in Quincy, Springfield, Peoria, and Bloomington Normal, to raise the awareness on this, get the adequate resources we need to fight heroin addiction and opioid addiction. Many of the addiction problems start with opioid addiction, and they lead to heroin. And I'm going to be vigilant on this and work hard with our local addiction specialists, educators, law enforcement to raise awareness.
All right, Congressman Darin LaHood, we sincerely appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks, Chad. Great to be with you.
Yep, take care.